Has anyone... Am I good? Can you hear me? Okay, felt like I wasn't on. Has anyone ever been to an escape room? I'm really asking. Anyone ever been to an escape room? It's okay. A few of you have? Okay. Does everyone know what an escape room is? Okay, an escape room, it's this new kind of an experience, I guess a thrill type experience, where what you do is you and a group of people go and you get locked in a room for an hour. And there's a certain situation, there's like a case you have to figure out in order to get out of the room. And everything in the room is a potential clue. You're looking to find the key to open a lock or the combination to open a lock. Sometimes there's multiple rooms, so you solve one room and you go into the next room and then you got to go back into the other room. But you have an hour to get out. They do let you out if you don't figure it out. It's okay. But so you have an hour, and it's actually really fun. And I've actually gotten to do a few over the last year. A few months ago, I took our students to an escape room down the road, and we actually had a lot of fun. So our situation for this one was called Cuckoo's Nest, and we were all in the first room. It was a doctor's office, and you're watching the TV, and they give you this scenario, and they say, you're visiting a friend at an asylum, and all of a sudden the asylum goes on lockdown. And in 1 hour, all of the doors will be unlocked, including the doors in the maximum security ward. And then you start. And everything in the room is a clue. And we did end up solving it. That one was kind of easy. They gave us some pretty obvious hints. So we did that one. The first one I got to do was a little over a year ago. And this one was with some men from the church. Some guys took me and Pastor Mike into the city for Pastor Appreciation Day, and we did an escape room there. This one was called, what was this one called? Mystery Room, New York City. And I don't remember the story exactly, but the first room is some guy's apartment, and this guy had gone missing a few months before. And the person who abducted him left a bomb in his apartment, and the bomb was going to detonate in an hour. It's not a real bomb, it's okay. But it was going to detonate in an hour, and so what you had to do, again, you used everything in the first room as a clue, and then you get into the second room, and using the clues in the second room, you figure out which wire to pull to disarm the bomb in the first room. And I think they told us that only like 20% of the groups solve it on time. We did. We did it with like 1 minute and 36 seconds left. It was awesome. So I've actually gotten to do a few over the last year. I know our young adult ministry went and did one over the summer, but chances are, even if you haven't done one, you know somebody who's done one. They're huge right now. People love them. But our culture really, we love these detective stories. We love these investigation stories. We love the feeling of solving a case or seeing a case being solved. And we see that in every element of our culture. In the books we read, when I was a boy growing up, I read the Hardy Boys a lot. Anybody read the Hardy Boys? Okay. Oh my gosh. Come on, guys. Raise your hands. It's okay to answer a question. So, you know what the Hardy Boys are. Frank and Joe Hardy, they're brothers, they're teenagers, they're amateur detectives. Their dad's a detective, so a lot of times they're working on the same cases their dad is working on. Or if you're a girl, maybe you read Nancy Drew, right? Anybody read Nancy Drew? And Nancy Drew is basically the Hardy Boys, but a girl. She was made by the same person. It's basically the same thing, but she's a girl. She's an amateur detective. Her dad's an attorney, so sometimes she's working on cases that her dad is working on. Of course, Sherlock Holmes, the classic, greatest detective of all time. He's a private detective. He's known for his powers of observation and reasoning. And I actually know this. I was reading about him this week, and it said he is the most portrayed movie character in history. So we love these stories. And comic books, too. I'm going to go there. Batman. Batman, a lot of times today, he's just portrayed as a thug. But originally, he was a detective. He was called the world's greatest detective. And the first time he ever appeared anywhere was in the May 1939 issue of Detective Comics. And he had himself trained in the arts of detecting and forensics and criminology. So at his core, at his heart, Batman is a detective. And we love him. He's endured for almost 80 years now. These are the shows that we watch. Has anybody ever watched CSI? You guys like CSI? Okay. About a group of forensic investigators at the Las Vegas Crime Lab. Last year, the show finished its 15-season run. 15 seasons. Shows don't go that long. 15 seasons. And it's had a lot of spin-offs, too. There's CSI Miami, there's CSI New York, there's CSI Cyber. We love these stories. I don't know if we've ever watched CSI, but Amanda really likes Bones. Anybody watch Bones? Anybody like that show? It's kind of similar. It's about FBI cases that are solved by a forensic anthropologist. It's a little gruesome. She analyzes the remains of human bodies that can't be identified because they've either been like burned or decomposed or mutilated somehow. But its 12th season starts in a month. Again, 12 seasons. We love these shows, and we watch them on TV. And we even try to experience them. I talked about the escape rooms. There's mystery dinners. I don't know if you've ever heard of a mystery dinner or been to one where you're eating dinner and there is a murder mystery going on the stage in front of you, and the actors even come out in the crowd, and while you're eating, you're trying to figure out who did it and solve the case. You can even get a kit or hire a group of actors if you want to host one at your house. And of course, who hasn't played the game Clue, right? Clue is the classic murder mystery board game. You figure out who committed the crime, where it took place, which weapon they used. You move around the house as one of the suspects, gathering clues. So we're almost obsessed with these things. We love detective stories. We love investigation stories. We just love solving a case, or usually watching other people solve it. And the reason I'm talking about this today is because for the next few months, we are going to be making our way through the Gospel of Luke. And at its core, the Gospel of Luke is an investigation. And what we'll see in our passage here in a little while is that Luke is an investigator. That's how he presents himself. He's an investigator, he's a journalist, he's a detective. You can almost see him with his notepad and his voice recorder and his magnifying glass, and he's traveling around and he's interviewing people and he's comparing stories and he's following the scent and gathering clues. And he is investigating the events of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And then he writes them in the Gospel of Luke. And the Gospel of Luke is really, it's his dossier. It's his case files on the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And he writes this gospel to prove that Jesus is God's Son. So if you have your Bible today, open it up to the Gospel of Luke. If you didn't bring your Bible, I'd encourage you to bring it next time, a real printed one, not the fake one on your phone. Open up to the Gospel of Luke. It's the third book in the New Testament. You have Matthew, Mark, and then Luke. And we're going to read right from the beginning today, from Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, we're going to read the first 4 verses. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So this is Luke's introduction, and this was pretty common in the ancient world. When you were going to write a work like this, you would have a formal introduction right at the beginning, identifying yourself, what the work is about, who it's written for. This is pretty common. And in the Greek, this is just one long run-on sentence. It's very elaborate. The Greek is very polished, very professional. Luke's kind of showing off how he can write here. Right at the beginning, telling us what his book is about. And right at the beginning, we notice that this is more than history. And there's a sense of prophetic fulfillment here. Because Luke doesn't just say, this is an account of the things that happened among us. He says, this is an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Showing that prophecy is being fulfilled here. These things didn't just happen. They happened to fulfill God's promises to his people. And in a few weeks, our brother Vinny DeBrico is going to be talking to us about how Jesus' birth especially fulfills God's promises to his people. But this is something Luke points out all through his gospel. These things aren't just happening, they're fulfilling God's promises. And then in the first few verses, Luke tells us his sources. He tells us where he got his information. And he says, many others have already attempted this. There's a lot of other people who wrote, a wannabe gospel. There's a lot of other people trying to write down the things Jesus said and the things Jesus did. And we get the idea that Luke has access to some of these accounts. These are some of the files he's collecting. He's looking at the stories that people have already written about Jesus, and he's compiling them, and he's comparing them, and he's using them to write his own. There's also a sense of authority here, a sense of authoritative tradition, because he says that these stories were handed down. And when he says that it's handed down, it's kind of the idea that, this has been set and established as the truth, and everyone recognizes it as the truth, and it's being formally passed on as the truth. This is a technical term, so there's some authority behind these stories because they were based on eyewitness testimony. He says they were handed down to us by those who were eyewitnesses. And Luke probably was not an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, but he had access to a lot of people who were. And as he's traveling, he's interviewing people, he's asking them questions, he's talking to people who knew Jesus, who heard Jesus, who saw Jesus, probably people who were healed by Jesus, and he's asking them questions and he's getting all of their stories. And it's also based on the authority of the apostles, because Luke probably knew the apostles and had access to them, especially the Apostle Paul. So he could have the authority of the Apostle Paul behind his gospel. And so what he's saying here is there's a lot of guys who have tried to write this book. I actually did it. Mine is better. This is the real story. And then in verse 3 he says, I myself investigated this. I myself. Now, we know the gospel was written by Luke because it's called Luke, but nowhere in the book does it say that Luke wrote it. This gospel never identifies its author. So he says, I myself. Who is it? Who's writing this? Well, church history says that it's Luke. Throughout the first couple hundred years of the church, several of the church fathers said that Luke wrote his own gospel, and they identify him as a doctor, as someone who traveled with Paul, and they say he wrote the book. And this is really confirmed to us from the Bible itself. We know from the book of Acts that the same person who wrote Luke also wrote Acts. And in Acts chapter 1, verse 1, the author says, In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach. So the guy who wrote Acts says he already wrote a book. It was addressed to the same guy, and it's about the same thing that the Gospel of Luke is about. And there's also, when you look at the language and the style of the book of Acts and compare it to the Gospel of Luke, it becomes clear that they were written by the same person. There's also passages in Acts, I don't know if you've heard of these, the we passages. I don't know if you've heard of the we passages in the book of Acts, but as Acts is telling stories about the apostles, usually the author's in third person. So he says, Paul does this, Paul travels here, Paul and his companions, it's third person. But sometimes he shifts and he switches to first person, and he says, we did this, and we did that, and we went there. And so, looking at the people who are with Paul in the book of Acts, when that we language is used, looking at the rest of the New Testament, looking at what the rest of church history tells us, by process of elimination, we can narrow it down that Luke is probably the one writing when he uses the word we. So really, church history tells us it was Luke. All the other evidence available to us confirms that it was Luke. And in the rest of the New Testament, Paul gives us some information. In Colossians, he says, my friend Luke, the beloved doctor. In Philemon, he calls Luke one of my fellow workers. And in 2 Timothy, he says, everyone's deserted me. Only Luke is with me. So we see that Luke was a doctor. He was a fellow worker in the gospel. He was a loyal friend to the Apostle Paul. And I want to share a quote with you from one of the early church fathers. This guy's name was Eusebius. He lived toward the end of the 3rd century, in the beginning of the 4th century as well. And here's what he says. But Luke, who was of Antiochian parentage and a physician by profession, and who was especially intimate with Paul and well acquainted with the rest of the apostles, has left us in 2 inspired books proof of that spiritual healing art which he learned from them. One of these books is the Gospel, which he testifies that he wrote as those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered unto him, all of whom, as he says, he followed accurately from the first. The other book is the Acts of the Apostles, which he composed not from the accounts of others, but from what he had seen himself. And this is cool. And they say that Paul meant to refer to Luke's gospel whenever, as if speaking of some gospel of his own, he used the words, according to my gospel. So we see that all the evidence is telling us that Luke, the doctor, the friend of Paul, wrote this book. And he says, I myself have carefully investigated this. Now again, Luke probably wasn't an original disciple, but he makes up for it with meticulous research. He says, I've carefully investigated everything relating to Jesus' life and ministry. You might not realize it, but Luke is actually the longest gospel of all 4. Now, it doesn't have as many chapters as Matthew, but when you look at the length of the entire book itself, it's longer than any of the other gospels. And remember, Acts is like the part 2. Luke's part 1, Acts is part 2. He wrote them both. And when you put them together, combined, they make up 25% of the New Testament. That's a lot. That's more than Paul, right? We always say Paul wrote half the New Testament. He wrote half the books of the New Testament, but when you look at the length of all his works together, it doesn't amount to half the New Testament. Actually, Luke contributed more to the New Testament than Paul did. So his influence is huge on what we believe about Jesus and what we believe about ourselves as Christians. So he investigated everything. He investigated it all. And he says he investigated it from the beginning. So Luke gives us the biggest time frame because he starts before Jesus' birth and he ends long after Jesus' ascension. So he starts before the other Gospels and he ends after them. And in fact, in the book of Acts, he carries Jesus' ministry through the early Christians all the way into the 60s. So he gives us the biggest time span as well. And he says it's an orderly account. He wrote an orderly account. And that word has the idea of chronology. And so a lot of people regard Luke's gospel as the most chronological of all four gospels. So he carefully investigated. He investigated it. He might not have been there, but he might as well have been because he researched it so well. And he says he wrote this account for Theophilus. So who is Theophilus? Who is receiving this work? Well, his name in the Greek means lover of God or friend of God, basically somebody who likes God. Theophilus was probably an individual person. He was possibly a Roman official. In the book of Acts, whenever Paul is giving an account before governors and kings, he refers to them as most excellent. So this might have been some kind of title about Theophilus' job. Or at the very least, he's an influential person. He's probably a wealthy person. And he might even be Luke's publisher. He might have been the one kind of backing this project and funding Luke and making sure the gospel got distributed. So we're not quite sure who he is, but those are some options. And that's who Luke is writing to. And again, it would have been common for, if you're doing a work like this back then, you acknowledge the publisher, right? You dedicate the book to them. That might be what Luke is doing here. And then in verse 4, he gives his purpose statement. He tells us why he's writing this gospel. He says, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. So that you, Theophilus, may know that what you've been taught about Jesus is true. So maybe this is someone that Luke is evangelizing. Maybe this is someone that Luke converted. Maybe this is someone who goes to church with Luke. Again, we don't know. But Luke wrote so that Theophilus would know that the gospel is true. And the word for certainty is interesting. When he says you may know with certainty, that's an interesting word because the rest of the time in the New Testament, it's usually talking about putting someone in jail. It's also the same word that's sometimes translated securely. So it says that they securely fastened their feet in the stocks, or they securely locked the cell door, or whenever Jesus dies and he's buried, they go and secure the tomb. It's all related to the same word for certainty. So it's talking about being so sure about something you could put someone away for it. And what he's saying is, I want you to know with that kind of certainty what you've been taught is true. This case is closed. You could convict Jesus as the Son of God. And so this is his proof of that. And let me just say, the early church needed this because the early Christians, they didn't have the whole Bible the way we do. What they had for the first few decades were stories. Now, this was an oral culture, so it wasn't like a big, long game of telephone. It was reliable. The stories were reliable. But after time, you had the true stories, and you had these other stories starting to get around about Jesus. And there were other stories about Jesus that didn't get put in the Gospels. And there were other Gospels that were written that didn't get put in the Bible. So after a couple decades, they started realizing, oh, we need some kind of standard. We need some kind of measurement that we can take these stories and take these Gospels and we can measure them against the truth so that we can point them out as being false. So Luke wrote this for Theophilus. He wrote it for the early Christians. He wrote it for us today so that anyone who hears about Jesus may know the certainty of what they've been taught. So that's why Luke wrote. That's the purpose of his investigation, so you may know. So we have this reliable account about Jesus. So what do we do with it? Right? Like, that's nice that we have it, but what do we do with it now? Well, I think obviously we believe in Jesus. I mean, if Luke's proved with certainty that Jesus is the Son of God, you believe in him. But I don't think that's enough. And I don't think that's the full reason that Luke wrote. I don't think Luke wrote just so that we could believe in Jesus. I think he wrote so that we could be like Jesus. Because you see, our goal as Christians is never just to believe in him. Our goal is every day to become more like him. See, in this gospel, Luke is setting Jesus before us as an example of Christian living, as a model of Christian maturity, as someone to imitate and something to strive toward. And I think that because throughout this gospel, it's interesting, Jesus does things in this gospel that the rest of the New Testament says we should do or will do in some form or another. Think about it. Jesus is born of the Spirit. He's baptized. He resists temptation. He preaches the gospel. He performs miracles. He prays. He shows compassion. He confronts injustice. He seeks out the lost. He suffers rejection and persecution. He sacrifices everything for his mission. And he rises from the dead. Again, all things that either Jesus himself or the rest of the New Testament says we as Christians should do or will do in some form or another. So I think we need to change the way we read the Gospels. Because usually we read them and it's like a picture of Jesus, right? We think that it's a portrait of who Jesus is and what he did. But it's more than that. It's not a picture. It's a mirror, right? Because a picture, you just look at it, you see the person, and that's it. You just see them. And usually that's how we read the Gospels. We think that's great, Jesus did this. That's great, Jesus said that. I believe in him. And that's as far as it goes. We like looking at the picture. But the Gospel's more than that. It's a mirror. Now, a mirror, it does more than just show you a picture. It reflects your image back to you. So we look in this mirror of Luke, and we see Jesus. But along with Jesus, we see our own reflection. And this Gospel reflects back to us the ways that we are reflecting Jesus' image and the ways we aren't reflecting Jesus' image. And then that mirror goes one step further, and it changes us until we reflect Jesus' image back to him perfectly. Right? So it's more than a picture. It's a mirror. And, you know, in a picture, too, you only get one angle, right? You only see the person from one angle. In a mirror, you see all angles, right? You can look this side, you can look this side, you can lean in, you can get two mirrors going for the back, you know. You can get every angle. And that's how the gospel works, too, because the gospel examines you from every angle. And it will reflect back to you every single way that you're reflecting Jesus and that you aren't. So it's more than a picture, it's a mirror. And the longer we look into this mirror, the more it changes us until we reflect back the picture that's in it. So the question I want to ask over the next couple months as we go through Luke, the question I want to keep asking is, what sort of Christian does Jesus want me to be? What sort of Christian does Jesus want me to be? And throughout the gospel, he shows us what sort of Christian he wants us to be. And in fact, the way he wants us to live is he wants you to live your life the way he would if he were you. Jesus wants you to live your life the way he would if he were you. And that's what it means to be a mature Christian. Really what it means to be a Christian at all. That Jesus is living through you so that you are living the way he would if he were you. That's what he wants. And so our purpose is a little bit different than Luke's purpose. Luke investigated Jesus so that you would know the truth about him. We're going to investigate Jesus so that you can become mature. So that you can become a mature Christian, so that you can learn how to be like Jesus in every way and express your belief in him by being like him. And because of that, it's going to get a little personal, right? You can look at a picture of someone you want to look like and not feel too bad. But then if you look at a picture of someone you want to look like next to a picture of yourself, it gets a little personal, right? You realize you're going to have to make some changes. Things are going to have to be different. You're going to have to really work to look like that person. And it's the same way. When we look at Jesus and when we read the gospel as a mirror instead of a picture, it gets personal and things have to change. What you believe about Jesus will probably change. How you believe about Jesus will probably change. It will change the way you think, speak, act, feel, respond, decide, the way you treat others. I mean, really, everything about you is subject to change when you're looking in the mirror of the gospel. So that's what we're going to do. Every week we're going to be asking the question, what sort of Christian does Jesus want me to be? And we're going to be looking to him as an example and a model of maturity. So as we conclude, I just want to say that now is the perfect time to focus on Jesus. And I know, right, like, any time is a good time to focus on Jesus. Okay, but like right now, as a church, this is the perfect time for us to focus on Jesus. Because as you know, right now, we're looking for a new senior minister, right? That's on everyone's mind. Every week when you come here, you're going to be wondering, did we get any resumes? Did we conduct any interviews? Do they want to bring anyone in yet? Who's the next guy going to be? And we're all thinking that, and hopefully we're all praying about that. But in the midst of that, let's not forget about Jesus, okay? Jesus has always been the head of the church. He's the head of the church now. He'll always be the head of the church. Above and beyond any human leader, Jesus is our king. He's our leader. He's our pastor. And so, yes, as we look forward to getting a new senior minister and as we work toward that, it's okay to think about that and pray for that. But even more, let's focus on Jesus and ask what kind of Christian he wants us to be.